BCS is the home of IT and technology professionals. We're a membership community that brings the industry together and helps shape it. This is BCS Membership. We're here to help you find your way in this brilliantly fast-paced industry. Our Career Centre and Personal Development Plan will help you get the skills and qualifications that will take you further. We're here to keep your career moving in the right direction. You can access the e-learning tools, career guidance and new contacts that add to your technical skills and create new opportunities, keeping you ahead of the curve. Through BCS, you can get professional recognition and work towards chartered status. As well as keeping your technical ability up to date, you can develop the people management skills that take you to the next level. With BCS, you're well connected. Regular opportunities to collaborate with your peers will help you drive policy on key issues, such as diversity and cyber education, so you and your teams are equipped for the future. We can help you become an important voice for the industry. By growing your network, you'll be able to share your knowledge and experience and help influence where IT and technology are headed and how it affects society. Join our global group of 60,000 professionals. If you're developing your career, membership is here to help you shape your future. And if you want to use the experience and insight you've gained across your years in the industry, through BCS membership, it's you that shapes the future.
Renovate your kit.
Oops.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this branch event here. My name is Altaf. I'm the chair of the branch, and today it's all about apprenticeships. So apprenticeships have become very popular, and I think they benefit both the employer and certainly those who actually do the apprenticeship, because I myself have been involved and sort of have apprenticeships working. So it's a great way to start as such in terms of a career. So we've got Dr. Malte Ressin, who will discuss the concepts behind apprenticeships in computing and explaining employer benefits and perspectives, as well as requirements on both the workplace and apprentices as well. So just a little bit about Malte Ressin. He's a senior lecturer for the School of Computing and Engineering at the University of West London. He's a course leader for the BCS Honours Games Technology course and the BCS Honours Digital and Technology Solutions as well. And prior to his 14 years stint in academia, he worked as software developer and localization team lead in Germany. So I'm going to now hand you over to Dr. Malte. Thank you, Doctor.
Right. You can hear me, right?
Can.
Oh, great. Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Malte Ressin. I'm, as Altaf introduced me so nicely, I'm going to skip over who I am. Thank you for joining my talk on apprenticeships in the computing sector. And right, yeah, and in this talk, I want to talk a little bit about how apprenticeships work in principle, what are the conditions, yeah, and how apprenticeships at higher education in the computing sector, how that is, what are the pitfalls, what organization, how can organizations benefit from that, how can apprentices benefit from that, what are the pros and the cons. I'm going to start by talking about where the concept of apprenticeships comes from, work-based learning and how that developed, work-based learning in higher education institutions in the UK and how that developed into the current iteration of apprenticeships. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about apprenticeship standards. What is an apprenticeship standards? What are the conditions for apprenticeships and the conditions under which apprentices would then study and work? I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of digital apprenticeships, what the content is and how these are assessed. And then I'm going to close by primarily talking about the employer view. What are the benefits or the perceived benefits or the intended benefits for employers, and what are the drawbacks? What are the intended benefits for the apprentices? What are potential pitfalls and drawbacks? And what is the perspective of the training provider? In this case, university. Myself, I got engaged in apprenticeships first about, now almost 5 years ago. when I was asked to teach on apprenticeships, and then very quickly I also got into the position of supervising apprenticeships in their final year project and assessing other apprenticeships for their final year project. That gave way to eventually becoming, once my colleague left, succeeding him as the course leader for degree apprenticeships a bit more than 2 years ago now. And in the meantime, I also had the opportunity as external examiner and validation panel member to see how apprenticeships are not only implemented here at our institutions, at the University of West London, but also to experience how apprenticeships are set up in other organizations. Because there's not the one true way of implementing apprenticeships. There's quite a bit of variation. Right. I should probably start by, I'm not sure how much experience you already have with apprenticeships. I would expect that there's probably 1 or 2 or 3 apprentices in the audience already. My perspective is very much from the academic perspective, that of a lecturer. So I like to think that I have a pretty good idea of the basics of the administration, but not necessarily every single intricacy. But in any way, I guess we all have a rough idea how an apprenticeship is supposed to work. The idea is that of work-based learning, right? We work and we learn at the same time, or apprentices work and learn at the same time. I should say that academically speaking, sorry, just a second. Academically speaking, work-based learning is a little bit more than just learning by doing. The fundamental idea is we all learn at work, right? We all go to work and then eventually learn something new. The general idea behind work-based learning, as it's practiced in knowledge management and knowledge retention or in apprenticeships, is that not only does learning take place in the workplace or as a consequence of working or something like this, but that's also needs to be a structured element outside of work. Dedicated or structured learning outside of the role, and that is really what apprenticeships are trying to bring to higher education. The fundamental idea of apprenticeships, I'm told, because I wasn't in the United Kingdom at the time, but the general idea of work-based learning and bringing higher education and work-based learning together is relatively old. It's my understanding that even in the 1950s, there were already sandwich courses, the idea of marrying higher education with placements in one course. And this idea was revived in the 1990s. At the time, there was a clear incentive or the intention to allow or to bring more people in level 2 education. And one of the methods of doing those was providing more vocational academic education at level 3 that then requires this level 2 education. And in any way, what happened then in the early and late 2000s was that there was a demand for skills that are traditionally taught at an academic level. Those who grew up in the 90s, like me, will maybe remember that there was a big drive of driving home that we transitioned from a society in which you have an education that you then use for 40 years to lifelong learning, to continually learn during your during your professional life. And then last but not least, there was a strong desire to widen the higher education participation, to make sure that people who traditionally would not study either because they are not the typical clientele to go to university right after school, or maybe they're already further along in their career and wouldn't go back to a pure university, to make sure that this part of the population would also join in higher education drives. And that led to the creation of apprenticeships in the UK as we know them now. And apprenticeships are the core idea is to have courses or the content that is taught not only be developed by higher education institution, but by the employer or by industry needs, to have that guide to give the industry more of a say what apprentices would learn, to allow the industry basically to change or to provide education or to participate in education for their own demands, their individual demands, so not industry as a whole, but on a company level. And sorry. Sorry for that. Specifically to make sure that education is embedded in the workplace, that there is an off-the-job learning, that's the structured learning, but also an on-the-job learning at the employer. And also to make sure that finds reflection in the assessment, so that assessment does not only take place in the usual orthodox university setting, but that then assessment also takes place in the workplace, or that what the actual work is assessed. And how that is realized is that there are so-called apprenticeship standards, and the apprenticeship standards are usually developed in collaboration between employers, training providers, universities, and professional bodies. And the apprenticeship standards in principle define three things. One is the funding band, how much money the training providers will get for the apprenticeship. We get to funding more in a minute. And then the second, the knowledge, skills, and behaviors that apprentices are supposed to learn during the apprenticeship. And then the apprenticeship standard also defines how the apprenticeship is assessed. That's usually in the form of what so-called endpoint assessment, and we'll get more into that in a minute. At the end of the day, an apprenticeship is a tripartite contract between three parties: the company, the employer, the apprentice, and the training provider, the university. The company, in principle, commits to employing an apprentice full-time. The exact threshold is, I believe, 30 hours, so they need to employ an apprentice at least for 30 hours. And then 20% of that time, the employer would release the apprentice for training by the training provider. The apprentice, the part of the apprentice is, of course, to work for the employer 80% of the contract time, and attend university the other 20% of the contract time. We will get back to that in a second. And the universities, the training provider's commitment is obviously to provide the training, prepare the apprentice for the endpoint assessment, and then depending on whether it's an integrated or non-integrated apprenticeship, also assess the apprentice. There are a couple of other duties that have to be that really lie with the company, the apprentice, and the university. For example, there has to be a tripartite review meeting every 12 weeks throughout the apprenticeship, but we'll get back to that when we come to funding. And I should also say that I should also mention at this point that the company hires the apprentice and pays them, obviously, releases them for 20% of the time, but also needs to provide a certain amount of structure within the organization to cater for the apprentice. So, for example, when we look at pathways later, if you have an apprentice in, let's say, cybersecurity, then the company obviously also needs to employ the apprentice in the cybersecurity area. There are what are the requirements on the apprentice? There are this kind of covered here. Yeah, as I said earlier, apprentices need to be in full-time employment for at least 30 hours a week. And it needs to be, there needs to be a job in which they would already learn something, still learn something. So it can't be an employment or role that they've had for the last 20 years, let's say. Apprentices must be UK residents and either UK citizens or basically are EEA nationals, or if they're not EEA nationals, either way must have lived here for 3 years. So in principle, UK residents. Yes, and there are different apprenticeships based on university level. So sorry, based on course level. So levels 2 and 3, that would be still GCSE or A level. There are apprenticeships for that as well, but we obviously don't do these at universities. Usually at the university, we have level 4 apprenticeships that are usually 18 to 24 months in length, and upon completion, you would get higher education certificate. There are level 6 apprenticeships that are then usually 3 or 4 years, and upon completion, you would get a Bachelor of Science. And then there are also level 7 apprenticeships. Those usually also last about 1.5 to 2 years. On completion, you would get a master's degree. I should say the degrees you get are fully equivalent with the degrees that full-time students would get. So for example, if you study for 3 years as an apprentice, you get a 360 credit Bachelor of Science honors. That would be credit-wise fully equivalent with an existing full-time Bachelor of Science degree. Right. How is this funded? The apprentice is paid as an employee by the employer. And actually, there's a minimum apprenticeship salary that is age dependent, but usually at university level, level 4 or up, these apprentices are old enough that they effectively need to earn national minimum wage. So the apprentice is first and foremost an employee of the employer, and is paid as such. And then the training provider is paid. That depends a little bit on the size of the organization. So we can distinguish between large and small organizations. Whereas where large organizations are basically companies or employers that have a payroll of more than £3 million. And if you have a payroll larger than £3 million, you pay what's called an apprenticeship levy. It's like an additional tax that funds apprenticeships. And the training provider is paid from that levy. You pay that levy whether you have apprentices or not. And this is one of the reasons why that serves as incentive for large organizations, partly as incentive for large organizations to get in apprentices in the first place. They pay the levy, so they could just as well try to get apprentices that are then have their training financed from that levy. For smaller organizations that have a payroll less than 3 million, they in principle have to pay the training provider, but it is my understanding that the government currently funds 95% of the costs for smaller organizations. The apprentices are relatively strictly regulated. At least as a lecturer, if I compare what the university has to provide as a lecturer, what I have to do as a lecturer for full-time students compared to what I have to do for apprenticeship students, apprentices are much more closely regulated or how should I say, observed by the government. So for example, I mentioned earlier, there's a requirement for a 12-month tripartite review meeting not 12 months, 12 weeks. Sorry, typo. So every 12 weeks, there has to be a review meeting between employer, apprentice, and training provider to discuss the state of the apprenticeship, whether the apprenticeship is moving forward, whether the apprentice receives the support he or she needs. And then the training provider also needs to provide evidence that training actually takes place. Because what really happens is that, if you think about it, the employer pays the apprentice for 100% of the time, right? But the apprentice would only work for 80% of the time and the other 20% of the time, the apprentice would then be required to attend training provider training, so come to university. And the university has an obligation to make sure to show evidence that that actually happens. So, and I guess here the intention is to make sure that apprentices don't do a weekend course and work 5 days a week, but that the apprenticeship, the training really is part of the, 1 day a week of the 5 days a week to work full time. That is really the apprenticeship, that happens during the week and not on weekends, And anyway, so the university needs to provide, what we do is we provide a complete attendance record. Apprentices have their card and need to swipe in all the time. And we also make apprentices write summaries every 2 to 4 weeks, what they trained. So we have a paper record to show that training took place. And yes, right, there are, if there are any questions, oh, right, yeah, sorry. Just looked at got the blinky from the chat. Right, so there are all kinds of different apprenticeships. The digital or computing related apprenticeships are usually maintained or managed by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. And they provide more than 100 different apprenticeship standards. And it really starts from level 4 apprentices for network technician, or here in my example, digital design technician, to level 7 game programmer. To my understanding, the most popular apprenticeships are level 4 high apprenticeship in data analyst, and level 6 the digital and technology solution professional, and then level 7 digital and technology solution specialist. And yes, this apprenticeship takes between 18 months and 3 years, plus the about 3 months time that it takes to conduct the endpoint assessment. Each of these, not each of them, but many of the apprenticeship standards are then subdivided further. So if we look, for example, at the Bachelor of Science, Digital and Technology Solutions Professional, you might ask yourself, what is a Digital and Technology Solutions Professional? That could be anything. And really, this one standard is then subdivided in 6 different pathways. Namely, software engineer, data analyst, IT consultant, cybersecurity analyst, business analyst, and network engineer. And if you maybe remember that earlier I mentioned that in the standard, the knowledge, skills, and behaviors are defined, the learning outcomes that need to be achieved in the apprenticeship, then the learning outcomes differ between the different pathways. So there's a set of core outcomes that all pathways share. Let's say being exhibiting professional behavior, or being able to apply the foundations of mathematics, or being able to write simple programs. Whereas then you have core KSBs, core skills and knowledge that relate to the specific pathway. So, for example, for data analysts might have to be able to do a regression analysis, and software engineers or business analysts would not be able to need to do that. So for each apprenticeship standard, there are different pathways that would then that effectively form their own course. I mentioned earlier that apprenticeships are assessed, that there is an element of assessment that should bring the workplace into the assessment. So if we take, so during apprenticeships, the apprentice would go to university or to the training provider and take different modules to achieve all the KSBs on an academic level. But they also need to evidence all the KSBs at work. So, and actually in 2 ways. So what I'm trying to say is apprentices go through all the assessments that regular full-time students go through: exams, coursework, homework, quizzes, you name it. And then on top of that, where full-time students have a final year project, apprentices have what's called the endpoint assessment. And in the endpoint assessment, they basically have to demonstrate all the KSBs, all the learning outcomes, but not in an academic setting, but in a practical workplace setting. The endpoint assessment usually consists of 4 parts. One is the employer assessment, where the employer gives the apprentice a grade for the 3 years that they've been in employment. And then there is the synoptic project, the portfolio, and the professional discussion. The portfolio is basically a document where the apprentice demonstrates all the learning outcomes, all the KSBs during the last 3 years at work. So they need to be able to show at work this knowledge that I was supposed to pick up, this skill that I was supposed to pick up, this behavior that I was supposed to exhibit here at work. I exhibited or proved that at work in the following way. That is evidence-based. So it's not sufficient that they say they did it. They need to provide a document or some kind of documentary evidence. So, for example, if there's a learning outcome, a skill, being able to program in a higher level language, then in the portfolio, the apprentices might supply code that they've written themselves. So the portfolio they have to evidence all the learning outcomes, how they achieved that at work. And then there is the synoptic project, and the synoptic project works like a final year project for full-time students, just that they don't do it at university with the university supervisor, they do it at work. And there is university supervision, but ultimately the synoptic project is really a work project. The capstone project that the apprentice should, on average, be working on for 6 months, 1 day a week. And in that synoptic project, they need to evidence the learning outcomes, the KSBs, the knowledge, skills, and behavior as well. And the synoptic project is usually decided on by what that is usually decided on by the university and the employer. But the guidance is it should be something that the employer wants the apprentice to do anyway. So it shouldn't be a dream project that then later on finds no use. Ideally, it should be something that the employer is really interested in, because the employer is paying the apprentice to do this. And so, for example, my favorite example is that a couple of years back, we had an employer and they had a ticketing system that was a bit old, and they never really got around to buying a new solution or developing their own new solution. And eventually they simply had the apprentice do this over 6 months. These are typical synoptic projects, but sometimes it also happens that it's a project for a client. Anyway, so that's the synoptic project. And the last element of the endpoint assessment is the professional discussion. And the professional discussion is basically an oral exam between an independent assessor and the apprentice, where they talk about the project, the synoptic project, and the portfolio. Usually, that is an opportunity for the independent assessor, the independent assessor assesses both the portfolio and this project, and then in the professional discussion, that's usually an opportunity for the assessor and for the apprentice to talk about the weaknesses of the project report or the portfolio document. If maybe the independent assessor is not convinced that a certain skill or knowledge has been evidenced. Because that's what the independent assessor does. He basically confirms whether if the apprentices has achieved all the learning outcomes, all the knowledge, skills, and behavior items. The professional discussion is usually between 30 and 120 minutes. It's usually between it's at least half an hour. At usually 60 minutes, under extreme circumstances, can take up to 2 hours. I should say I talk about this very quickly in 5 minutes, but really this part, the endpoint assessment, is again very strongly regulated. These apprenticeship standards define very, very clearly how that happens. For example, there is a regulation that says that the independent assessor has to ask at least 4 questions. And yes, right. So that is in principle the structure of an apprenticeship. What is the benefit, or what is the intention or the potential benefit for employers, for apprentices, and for the training providers, and what are the tricky parts of it? The idea for the employer is really that strategic workforce training by using public funds. The idea for the employer is train be involved in the training of your personnel, rather than hiring people on the workforce market that have previously gone to university and then having to deal with what they didn't learn at university, but you need them to know. The idea instead is be a part of the higher education of the higher education institutions education. Your apprentices work for you while they are trained by, in our case, the university, and but you can take a part of that. The employer can take a part of that. They can, for the sake of an argument, the university teaches you Rust, but you need your employees to know Swift. So you teach them Swift while they're learning Rust at university, let's say. Be able to train people for your own needs. Some organizations also use apprenticeships because they have a need for a certain skill or for certain abilities, but they don't have enough in-house, and it's difficult to recruit. So they send off people to higher education institutions to take an apprenticeship and at the same time work in the organization with the goal of disseminating whatever they're learning at university in the organization. Some organizations, I'm given to understand, also feel the need to recuperate the apprenticeship levy. They are large enough that they have to pay the apprenticeship levy, so they want to get something out of it. And last but not least, apprenticeships are attractive to some students who would otherwise not go the orthodox higher education path, and that is otherwise inaccessible talent that now the employer can get engaged with. So, for example, not everybody will be willing to go into debt, significant debt, to earn higher education, to get a university degree. But you can instead do an apprenticeship. You still get a university degree, but if everything goes well, you're not going in debt. The difficult part for employers is, by my observation, there's no guarantee that they can actually retain the apprenticeship after the apprenticeship completes, because they're ultimately just employees, and sometimes you notice that employers can be quite nervous about that. If they had a hand in training an apprentice and they really would like to keep them for a couple of more years to get something out of it, and there's no way for them to actually guarantee that. In fact, while generally I think our attrition for apprentices isn't too high, there's not even a guarantee necessarily that apprentices will complete. So it does happen that apprentices change their mind, don't want to complete the course, or feel that the employer is not the right one for them. And there is a certain amount of resources that employers have to, a certain amount of resources that employers usually put into apprenticeship beyond the 20% of the job training time for apprentices. So as I said earlier, there's this 12-weekly apprenticeship review meeting that has to take place. But usually there's more provisions within an organization that employers, so as we will discuss later, an employer usually has a should have a dedicated mentor for apprentices, for example. And again, that's an investment that a bound resource that is not available for something else during the apprenticeship. For the apprentices, what is the benefit of doing an apprenticeship? Well, first of all, you get a higher education degree if all goes well. And you have practical experience built in. Easily comparable to an internship. So the apprentices who complete after 3 years, not only have they have a pretty good foundation, theoretical foundation from university, but usually they also gained, basically they come out after 3 years and they've worked for 3 years in the industry. They know what is what. So, for example, full-time students in software engineering don't necessarily learn at university really how to use GitHub. But if you work in a software engineering company, after 3 years, you know how to use GitHub by definition. Apprentices have the big advantage, and I think that's one of the very attractive factors, that they don't go into debt for that degree. Instead, they're paid. So that must be pretty attractive. And apprentices, generally speaking, in my observations, also do rather well academically, because not only are they, going to university 6 to 8 hours a week, depending on exactly how they do it, but then they also gain work experience. They basically eat their own dog food at the same time. They don't only learn the theory at university, then usually also apply practically at work what they just learned at university. So many apprentices are really, really very good at what they do. The downside to apprenticeships are it can be stressful. You have your 32 hours a week or so working, and then on top of that, 8 hours university, and you need to cram in university in a very limited time. So let's say you have to work for assessments. You either do it during your off-the-job time, or you have to somehow cram it in the evenings, because the other time of the week you're probably working, or in the weekends. So, for example, what we do at the University of West London is that most of the time students have a day release day. Apprentices are on day release, so they come into university 1 day a week, and the remaining 4 days they're working. And whatever they have to do for university, they either complete in that 1 day, or in the evenings, or on weekends. And at least that's the idea. And that can be very, very stressful, especially if you have more assessments, or if you struggle a little bit with time management, or sometimes there might be a high tide at the employer, and then you have to do overtime there. So combining the work with university, you have in some ways the best of both worlds, but in some ways also the biggest stress of both worlds. Then apprentices do miss out on, up to a point, on the conventional university experience. So, for example, at the University of West London, we have a student union, we have student societies. And for apprentices, it's not always easy to participate in that, because it's not necessarily on their off-the-job day. So if apprentices go to university on a Monday, but some student party is on a Wednesday, or the the Alan Turing Society means on Thursday, then it might become difficult for the apprentice to participate in that. Same for the different offers that the university might offer to students. And and then apprentices are relatively committed. So I'll get back to that later, but generally speaking, apprentices are to a degree dependent on the employer, because the apprenticeship is ultimately employer-led, and apprentices can't easily change employers. It is possible, but basically, if hypothetically speaking, you're not happy with one employer, you can't simply quit. You need to basically line up your next employer, who would then be willing to continue with your apprenticeship. Apprentices who either leave or are being made redundant have a time limit how long they can continue being apprentice until there wouldn't be funding anymore. You need, in principle, to be an apprentice, you need to be in employment. And if for whatever reason you're not in employment anymore, because your employer went bankrupt, or you were made redundant, or maybe you want to change employers, that is a bit more tricky for apprentices. What's the benefit for the training provider? In my case, at university, I mean, we have obviously you get the funding from apprenticeships if you take on apprentice. What I found very interesting is that you can have real-time feedback between what you teach students and what happens in the industry. So, for example, a couple of weeks back, we had apprentices who very constructively pointed out that some of the things they're being taught in our distributed computing module, systems module, isn't really that current anymore, and that the industry standard has moved on. And that can be quite valuable, that you get this direct feedback from apprentices who can tell you exactly what is current in the industry, what are they working on, what are current technologies, and so on. And the downside for university or for higher education institutions is that this is a bit the administrative part that is a bit further away from where I am, but the apprenticeship provisions do require, as I mentioned earlier, a certain amount of compliance, having the review meetings, having documentation, monitoring attendance, for example, and it also comes with offset inspections. So universities are usually, in my understanding, fall under the eye of the Office for Students, but apprenticeships basically mean that you also eventually will have offset inspections. So there's an additional workload that universities have to consider. Yes, and there's a certain amount of, I mentioned earlier that both for the university and for the employer, in particular for the employer, in addition to this 20% of the job, releasing the apprentice for 20% for training. There's probably more investment behind that, and there's a certain amount of support that for apprenticeships both the employer and the training provider need. So you probably need to have a contract manager at the university side to deal with the employers, because you still have your tripartite contract with each employer. And then, in addition to the course leader and the lecturers that you need anyway, you probably have some kind of apprenticeship administrator at the university level, and you need to have a personal tutor and what's called an apprenticeship support link tutor. The person who then actually does, for example, the tripartite review meetings with the employer, who coordinates beyond the academic level, is the apprenticeship going the right way. And the employer should also provide not only the line manager who would line manage the apprentice anyway, but also a mentor who helps apprentices through their apprenticeships. Provide vocational and pastoral support. At the University of West London, not to talk too much about ourselves, in computing, we offer 3 different apprenticeships. I've mentioned them before. The level 4 apprenticeship data analyst, 1.5 years to 2 years. The level 6 apprenticeship digital and technology solutions professional, where we offer the 5 pathways, basically all pathways with the exception of the network engineer. And at level 7, at master's level, we offer the DTSS, Digital and Technology Solutions Specialist Apprenticeship in Cybersecurity and Data Analytics. And the way we do it, just to give an idea how it can be done, the key point is that we somehow need to provide this 20% of the job training, right? That's our job. So what we do is, most of the time, during 2 out of apprentices come to universities for 3 semesters a year. September to January is semester 1, February to June is semester 2, and then June, July is semester 3. And in the first 2 semesters, it's day release. So apprentices come to university 1 day a week. The remaining 4 weeks, the remaining 4 days, they would work at the employer. And in the summer, we ask the apprentices to come in for block release. So they would come in for 1 or 2 weeks, and then the rest of the summer, they would spend with their employers or maybe take holidays, because apprentices shouldn't take holidays during the off-the-job days, because they have to attend universities then. But that's not the only way to do it. So other providers, for example, only do it in block release, that apprentices go to the provider for 2 weeks, and then they go back to the employer for 8 weeks. And then they come back for the provider for 2 weeks and go back to the employer for 8 weeks. So different provisions are possible. What should be considered both on the employer and the apprentice side is that ultimately the apprenticeships are employer-led. So apprentices are, as I said earlier, regular employees, and up to a point dependent on the employer. So for example, employers, whereas full-time students could defer, maybe they feel that they need to take a break from studying. For apprentices, it's the employer who would have to initiate that. So the employer can put the apprentice on a break in learning. For apprentices, it's always easiest if they stick with one employer for the duration of the whole apprenticeship, as I pointed out earlier. So changing employers is probably a bit complicated it's generally a complication. And changing learning institutions it is probably also complicated for apprentices. It is possible, but it's more complicated. It's even more difficult for apprentices than I would argue it is for full-time students already, getting prior learning recognized and so on. Not all apprentices are necessarily from the school leavers who just completed schools. We have a decent number of apprentices who really have been with an employer for a while, and then for one reason or the other go on an apprenticeship. I sometimes I don't know this for certain, but sometimes I feel, as I mentioned earlier, the employer needs certain knowledge in the organization, so they send one of the employees on an apprenticeship, which is exactly what it's intended to be. Sometimes I have the impression that maybe people go on an apprenticeship in lieu of a raise or promotion. In either way, if you're already established as an employer and have been working there for a number of years and then go on an apprenticeship, can always be challenging, because going back to higher education, if you've already finished with that, is not always easy. What is last but not least, if you're an employer and you toy with the idea of engaging with apprenticeships, or if you're an apprentice and if you're a prospective apprentice and look for an apprenticeship, what is important for the employer? It's really important to select well. If you whether you're recruiting internally or whether you are looking for school leavers and want to send them on apprenticeship, look very well. It's all in selection. We're basically hiring an employee. You're exactly hiring an employee. And for apprentices, there's fundamentally a big difference whether you join a large organization or a small one. Large organizations usually have dedicated structures around apprenticeships. There are probably employees who mentor apprenticeships and have done so for years, so they have the experience how that works. Whereas with smaller employers, it might well be that they have never had experience with apprenticeships before, and then a lot more responsibilities lie in the hand of the apprentice. And that took much longer than I thought it would take, but that leads me to the conclusion of my talk.
Thank you, Malte. We've got a question. Can one with a master's degree in computing have a chance to do apprenticeship, since full-time work is not forthcoming due to no UK experience?
That is a good question. So it is possible to have a master's degree and then do an apprenticeship. It's just, it would be important that the apprenticeship is not in the subject that you have a master's degree in. So generally speaking, if you already have the qualification, the government will not be willing to pay for you to receive the same qualifications again. But in principle, it's not. There is no law that says if somebody has a master, he can't get an apprenticeship. It just needs to be in a different subject area that he has the master's in. But the thing to keep in mind is that full-time employment is a requirement of an apprenticeship. You need to first find somebody to employ you full-time, and then they need to agree to release you for 20% of the time to do the apprenticeship. Yes? And usually what happens is you can approach universities, but the universities would ultimately always tell you that you need to find an employer. And sometimes employers advertise with universities, but in the end, it's down to the employer to decide whether they take somebody on as apprentice or not.
All right, thank you. There's another question from Ayo. It says, I'm a software developer in a senior role. I develop my technical competencies 80% on the job, and I'm trying to convince my employer to agree to degree apprenticeships.
So just to get this right, Ayo, you would like to be the apprentice?
I'm confident in the benefits for me and apprentice. I have completed the leadership apprenticeship 12 marks. What would you say are the main advantage for my employer? So I think person wants to get into apprenticeship and asking, what is the benefit that's going to be for the employer, because wants to
that's a good one, because that depends very much, I guess, on what your employer needs. I would always. That's a good question. I think I would probably look at what skills are needed at work that are maybe in high demand, in short supply, and then pick an apprenticeship that would fit with that. So, for example, for the sake of an argument, let's say your employer doesn't have a lot of cybersecurity expertise, then maybe go with that, right? You could say this is a way for you, the employer, to build more expertise. I should emphasize that you still need somebody there should be some expertise at work, because you need to learn something at work about, in this case, cybersecurity, right? Sorry, there was, I see there's more. I have completed a leadership apprenticeship with top marks. That's, I guess, off the top of my head, I would suggest look at, is there a skill area that you're interested in and where you can make the case that the employer will benefit from it if you achieve this, if you acquire this competence. I hope that is a good answer.
Great, thank you. There's another one from Alessandro. Says studying DCS computing at Arden USB, and it's about which level of apprenticeship that might suit.
Alessandro, that's a good question. So that's in principle, I don't know at what level you are right now, but for example, if you've, you can either join a level 4 apprenticeship or level 6 apprenticeship or level 7 apprenticeship. If you want to do the level 7 apprenticeship, you need to have completed a Bachelor of Science already. And I guess from your question, that's probably not the case, so that's out of the question for you. So I understand this to mean that you haven't completed your Bachelor of Science in Computer Science yet and want to transition into an apprenticeship. And in that case, look at the level that you've already achieved. So maybe you've already completed level 4 at your Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, and then look for a training provider where you can join at level 5. It is in principle possible to have previous learning recognized for apprenticeships. So that would be the route for you. Look at what you've already completed in computer science, look at what apprenticeship you're interested in, and if there's an overlap between what you've already learned and what you're then supposed to learn in that apprenticeship you're so completed in, you need to discuss with the training provider in how far they can recognize the credits you have already achieved. We do, for example, not to advertise us, but we do that at the University of West London, and we need to do it because, as I said earlier, the government is not willing to fund apprenticeships or even part of apprenticeships when you already have the skills. So you need to just need to engage with the respective institution or training provider you're interested in and look for what their regulations are recognizing already achieved credits or learning. I hope that is a good answer.
Thank you. There is Umar says he's a graduate from India and wants to know, he's got 10 plus years, sorry, I think it's, what would the requirements to become an apprenticeship or join the apprenticeship program be?
Because it says I want to join a university job, should I go under an apprenticeship? It's what I mentioned earlier. So if you already have experience and already have a degree, that doesn't exclude you from an apprenticeship, but you then need to find an apprenticeship. But you need to find an apprenticeship that you have where you would learn something new. Yes, and in your case. And remember what I said earlier, you would need to be a resident in the UK already for a certain amount of time. Should I go undergo any apprenticeship? That's difficult to say. It's ultimately for you to decide whether you should do that or whether you want to do that. I'm not quite sure what I should respond to that.
There's another interesting one by Lorraine.
I qualify for some grants from the government. Will I be able to do a degree apprenticeship and also claim the grants, or will I not be able to claim the grants? Also with degree apprenticeship, are we expected to continue with the company? So that's two questions, very good. With the grants, that's a good question. So I would probably say that would be a question for one of my colleagues who are more intricately aware of exactly how. That seems to be a very specific question. But I think part of it is remember that it depends a bit on what the grants are for. So not knowing that, if it's, for example, a grant for studying, then my assumption is that you probably can't claim the grant if you do an apprenticeship, because if you do an apprenticeship, you're not paying for your study fees anyway. That's paid from the apprenticeship levy, right? And then if you have a grant, a bursary, that wouldn't, I'm not sure if that still applies. I guess it really depends very much on what the grant is for. Does that make sense? So if it's a grant that partially is meant to offset your study fees, that wouldn't really apply because you wouldn't be paying any study fees as an apprentice. But to be specific, but it's probably best that way. It would probably be better to then look at go to the training provider and specifically mention, I'm receiving these grants for this and this reason. Which of these are compatible with an apprenticeship? With the question, are you expected to continue with the company after you got your degree, and on average how long? A very good question. And the truth is, the moment you complete your apprenticeship, or even before, you're an employee. You can leave the employer at any time. You would still have your notice period, right? But whether before or after you complete, you can leave at any time. I would obviously always recommend first complete your apprenticeship. Yeah, if you then want to change employers, and quite a few apprentices do that. They complete the apprenticeship and then they move on to a different employer. So there's no obligation to stick with the employer for a certain amount of time.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Malte. I'm just conscious of the time, but no, I just want to wrap it up, I think, now. But thank you for the talk. Very interesting. And I think I myself learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience there as well. So thank you. We will be uploading this presentation on YouTube, and more permitting, we'll get the slides and have it available on our website as well. But certainly, thank you to all who attended, and Malte, thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.